In today's video, I'm going to show you how to paint the Rogal Dorn battle tank in the classic Cadian 7th color scheme from start to finish. This video is broken down into multiple stages. First, we'll talk about some preparation you can do beforehand, then we'll go into base coating, on to washes and highlights, and then on to other detailing such as weathering. So this will progress you through from start to finish on how to paint the Rogal Dorn. This video can also be used for any other Cadian vehicle. This tutorial does begin after I've completed the magnetizing of the vehicle. So I've already done the work to magnetize the turrets, to magnetize the sponsons, and the hull mounted weapons for the vehicle. That tutorial is available on my YouTube channel and you can go watch it in the link below in the description. So a little bit of filming time jump here, but I just want to go ahead and highlight something that I think you all should do earlier in your build and paint of the Rogal Dorn, or even the Lahmian or other models with rotating turret weapons. So I did notice that this fit here between this moving turret and its hull is a little tight, and it often chips away some of the paint. Not so bad on this one that I built and painted, but it was worse. I'm building and painting two of these at the same time, and this one was, see, much worse. It was wearing away here. So how you can deal with that is very simple. What you can do is, preferably when you're actually building the model, and I'll place this step earlier in the video, you can just take a scraping tool or your hobby knife and just scrape away at that little bit as you're assembling the model. I will post this video at that point. But say you've already skipped ahead like me, or you've discovered later and this is going to bother you. You can take something like your hobby knife and get in there. And what you want to do is, I like to take the back edge and basically just, you don't got to take away too much, but just scrape a little bit that edge. And not very much, just enough so where you can start to see that where I'm creating that gap. It's all you want. And once you've created that gap and you file that away across the whole thing, then you can just paint it again. And then as you move the turret, it will not chip your paint away in the future. So that's one way that you can handle it. Yep. See that right there? That's what you want to go for. Just a tiny little gap. All right. So to begin getting ready for doing the camo pattern on our vehicle, what we want to do is first base coat all the components. What I've chosen to do is Xandri dust for the tank itself. So the hull and all the other components are coated in Xandri dust. I did this with my airbrush because I do live in a climate that is currently cold and it's always very moist here. Lots of humidity, so it makes it difficult to use a spray can. But if you live in a place you can use a spray can, I highly recommend it. But I have painted other things different colors. So all the sponson weapons are painted with Abaddon black. And then I've painted the stubbers and the meltas and the Gatling cannon with Leadbelcher. And I've done all of my tank treads and Leadbelcher to get ready. To do the camo pattern, we're going to use a airbrush to do this, but you can also use a hand brush if you want to. Just when doing it with a regular paintbrush and acrylics, make sure to thin down your paints and do it with multiple layers. But to prep for it, what we're going to use is this Loctite Fun Tack. So it's mounting putty, it's poster putty, right? I really like this brand. I think it works very well. You can take it off, reuse it multiple times, and it's very simple to apply. So what we'll do is we'll take it out of the packet. When you do, it's like this, right? You'll take pieces of it, you'll stretch them out, you'll widen them out, and then we will apply those over the body of the vehicle in order to create patterns. So this will prevent, so think about it, this is like a negative, right? Wherever we place this, there will not be any of the camo paint that I spray. The tan will remain underneath. So think about where you want the tan to stay. The other thing you want to do when applying this, I like to apply everything at a certain angle. All of my camo goes at this direction generally across my tanks. So from the front right corner to the back corner, it moves in that direction. Although I do like to break it up sometimes and do like blobs where I just like round out an area to create like a blotch of one color, and then the rest of it kind of stripes in that way. So when applying it, you also want to break up the edges, the hard edges, right? It's part of the point of camouflage to break those hard edges. And so this way it's harder to tell what the shape of the thing is, whether it's a person or a vehicle. You want to try to conceal that. So you would take your putty, you would lay it down like this, push it down nice and even, but not too much, right? We do have delicate components on here, such as the tools or maybe certain weapons and the aerials or antenna. So you do want to be careful about that and push it down with just enough force to get it to apply, to hopefully leave like this right here, no gaps underneath. You will continue to do this and create lines or blotches across the vehicle to conceal those areas you want to remain tan. Anything left exposed will be our camouflage color, which for this will be Castellan green. Okay, pull our poster putty out of the packet and let's stretch it out now, right? Pull it out, flatten it out a little bit. Make sure there's no holes in the middle though, as you do pull it apart. Flatten it out, because it's kind of, right, the thickness is more than what we need, and so you want to get it down to about half the thickness it is when you pull it out of the packet. That's good to start with. And the reason being is you still want some manipulation in this after you apply it to the vehicle. We also want to get rid of like any of my finger shapes there at the end. So if you can see sometimes that's clearly like my finger pushing out and stuff like that. Try to find moments, push those edges together, even them out a little bit, so it doesn't look like all of my fingertips are just the edge of the camo, right? You want to break it up. It should be an inconsistent pattern along the edges, not jagged or anything. I do like smooth, kind of flowing camo on my vehicles. See how I did that? All right. So I'm going to cover up this front corner here and wrap it around the vehicle. So come down like this, push it in place. So now be careful. So like here, right, I got a tow hook underneath that moment. So I don't want to push too hard because I don't want to break that tow hook off. So make sure you're gentle where you need to be and firm away from those points to make sure you seal off, especially if you're using an airbrush, any overspray of where you'd be doing the camo. I'm going to continue over like this, push that down, push it in over here. One thing to note, and you may have a question about, is that you're like, wait, Kitty Sergeant Steel, you have your track guards on. You have your armored track guards on, but your tracks are off. I've actually just put these on. Watch this. See that? They're just attached with a couple little tiny dots of super glue. Okay, so this way, after I spray it, and I get the camo pattern on, I can pop these off, put the tracks on underneath, and then sit this back down on top of it, and then continue painting. All right, so continue like this. Get your poster putty out, continue to get those strips off there, and then push it and apply it and create these strips that really break up. See, look, I'm breaking up this corner, this hard edge, breaking up the front of the hull. I'm breaking up the side. Look where the sponson is, but part of the sponson is going to be green, and then the rest of it is not. So these are the type of things you want to try to achieve when working this. Another thing I could do is I could bring like the poster putty down and cover this whole front corner here and just make one whole blob of the tank still tan. And then the rest of it striped. And that, once again, tricks the eye and breaks up the pattern. Makes it a little more realistic. With the two ways to base coat our Castellan green, first I'm going to show you how to airbrush. With this, get your airbrush booth, particularly if you have something that captures the off spray that comes out of your airbrush, like I have here, got this cheap off Amazon. place your Castellan green into your vertical feed on your airbrush. If you're using it straight out of the pot, you can dilute it down with some paint thinner, some airbrush thinner, or you could even use a little bit of water. I have found better results with some of the airbrush thinner myself. And then spray that onto your model. I myself am using some of the air paints from Citadel, so I actually have some Castellan green airbrush paint here. When airbrushing your Castellan green, make sure to spray it in nice thin coats over your model, and to make sure to try to get in around your poster putty that you've placed onto here. So make sure you don't have any kind of dusting areas where there's not a clearly defined line in your green camo pattern. So go around the model, spray it on nice and thin, maybe even do a couple layers if necessary. I do recommend it, and continue around until you get the whole thing coated in green. When brushing on Castellan green, I recommend using a large base brush. I'm using this synthetic one here from Games Workshop. Take your Castellan green and place it onto a wet palette preferably, and thin it down. You want this to be as thin as possible, almost a milky consistency when applying it onto the model. You'll have to do several layers. All of this is so that you prevent your base coat of Castellan green from having brush strokes in it. Castellan green can be a thicker paint. It also requires several layers though to actually hide the Xandri dust underneath. So go ahead and begin applying this to your model, work it all the way around, and then come back and apply 1 or 2 additional coats of Castellan green over top of that as necessary. All right, this is one of the most satisfying parts of doing a camouflage pattern, whether with an airbrush or a brush, is finally removing the putty and revealing the camo pattern. So let's give it a go. Now, do make sure when you're doing this, there are some parts of the tank, such as the hatches, the aerials or antenna, or the little tow hooks on the back of the vehicle. These can be brittle and they can be broken off. So do make sure, or fragile, not necessarily brittle, but fragile. Make sure you do take your time removing the poster putty around those portions of the vehicle. Sometimes when removing the blue tack, some of it will get stuck behind. Just take a little piece of it and stick it to the pieces that are left behind, and it should pull them right off. You may have to dab it a couple times in order to get all the little pieces off, just like that, but it will come off. Just be patient and put it on there. You don't really want to paint over top of it because with that blue tack, it will rub off while handling it, and then obviously you won't have your desired paint underneath or even your weathering later on. So there we have it, the revealed camo pattern of the Rogal Dorn. The next step will be glue on the tracks that I have left off and painted Leadbelcher separately. But now that we have our camo pattern down, what we want to do is, if you did the same steps I did, I had lightly glued on these track covers. You'll want to pop those off and then glue your tracks on. The next step that we want to do is clean up our camo pattern from either the airbrushing or hand brushing it on. So what we'll do is use our Castellan green or our Xandri dust, get a little bit on our palette, and we'll actually start to clean up any of the overspray or overbrushing which may have happened. This commonly occurs for a number of reasons, such as when your airbrush sprays underneath your putty because it wasn't firmly in place, or maybe it didn't spray well enough into the recesses and voids as you wanted it to, creating a splash or overspray area rather than a nice neat line. One example is, if we look right here on the model, we can clearly see a little bit of overspray. Take your brush, you just begin to neaten those lines back up, right, with a nice thin down set of paint. Oop, over here, same thing happened, there's a little bit of overspray. Just ground your model nice and neatly, clean those lines up. There we go. The next phase of painting our Rogal Dorn will be blocking in the other base colors. So I'm going to start out with the metallics. So I'm going to get things such as the tools, the exhaust ports on the back, and my demolisher cannon here. So I've got a little bit of Leadbelcher that I'm using from Games Workshop, and I'm going to apply that to my model. Now that we have all of our metal detail blocked in, and there was quite a bit of it, I'm going to move on to a smaller set of details, which are the wooden ones. So things such as the handles on the equipment, or putting little dents and scratches into my green painted wooden crate. So I'm going to block those in now. What I'm going to use is Dryad bark from Games Workshop. So I've got a little bit of my wet palette here. Bring up the model, and then pick out any of those wooden details. There's a few of them here. There's the handle of the axe, there's the handle of the shovel, and like I said, also putting a few dents, scratches, and dings real finely onto the crate, making it look like it's been beat up just a little bit, and we'll call the edges of that out later with some green highlights to make that show up a little better. So, all right, I'm going to get that done and then come back. Next thing we're going to do is another small detail on this model. I'm going to be using Tallarn sand, but really any kind of medium tan or brown will do in order to paint the ropes on the model. So this is usually on the stowage. So we have some ropes over here that are with the sandbags. We have a piece of rope over here over the crate, and there may be other ropes depending on how you've kitted out your model. So get a little bit of Xandri dust or whatever darker tan or brown you want to use. You can see where this is just going to create a subtle difference between our Xandri dust. This Tallarn sand is going to create a subtle difference between the Xandri dust and itself. So it'll be just enough that when we go to put washes on it and highlight it later, it should stand out as a different material. is just simply apply your Xandri dust across the areas that you want to look like rope. Don't forget to include the handles here on your crates as well. Now with all of our ropes painted in, we are going to do the leather. So for the leather, we're going to be using Rhinox hide from GW. So I've put a little bit on my wet palette here. And now what we're looking for are the leather straps that are holding down more of our stowage. So I'm just going to start working from the front here and head towards the back of the model, carefully picking out all of these leather straps because I don't want to ruin the tan. But if I do, I can just come back in with a little bit of Xandri dust spray, clean those right up. With all of our leather blocked in, the next thing we're going to work on are the lights. So we're going to work on the headlights here and also the spotlight that is on the turret. So for this, I'll be using Averland Sunset as my yellow to fill those in. And later, we'll do some shades and highlights to really make them pop. For now, get a little yellow onto your wet palette and your brush and work in those lights. Now, if you mess up just slightly and you get a little bit of it on the adjacent tans or greens, don't worry too much. We're going to be coming in later with Agrax Earthshade washes and other washes and highlights, so you'll be able to clean it up. If it's too egregious though, just get a little Castellan green or Xandri dust and get that cleaned up pretty easily. So there's our two lights, and then we have our spotlight as well. Now for this, don't worry about the grid over top of the spotlight. What I like to do is get in here, get all of this done, all the detail work of the yellow, and then come back later and put the metal in. So I'll come back with Leadbelcher and basically highlight that grid over the spotlight right back up. Now, Averland Sunset is pretty thin, so it may take multiple coats to get a good, smooth finish. See that? I'm going to need a few more coats on that. With all of our yellow blocked in, next thing we want to do is move on to some Cantor Blue, and we will be using this to block in the viewports on the Rogal Dorn, like here on the front. There's some on the sides, and there's some on the turrets as well, especially right here on the turret. They recommend to put the commander in. So we will, but there's none over here. These other details, these lenses, we will be using a red later on. So for the viewports, get a little Cantor Blue, nice good dark blue. Get in there, try to be nice and neat so you don't have to do too much cleanup. Block in those viewports. Now with all of our viewports blocked in with Cantor Blue, we're going to move on to Corn Red, and we'll be using this for all of our sensors and other kinds of lens apparatuses on our vehicle. So put a little bit of this on your palette, and to start with, let's grab one of our turret weapons here. So it's got a couple of these like little sensors. They're here on the front, and we'll paint all those lenses red. As well, we will get any of the other stuff on the turret itself. For example, there's this little piece here, which I've always used as like a vehicle identifier for night fighting. And then this little lens here, I will also be painting red. So get those blocked in, and then we'll move on to the next steps. For the next color in our tutorial, we'll be using Mechanica Standard Gray to paint the fuel tanks on the back of the Rogal Dorn. Now, historically, I used to paint these with corn red since they were fuel tanks, but then I realized it kind of actually was too bright and was too much of a key color that it took away from the rest of my tank and drew the attention away from the viewer. So now I use Mechanica Standard Gray is what I'm going to paint these up with. So get a little bit of our wet palette and brush and then begin applying it to the model. Now, what you want to do is avoid the straps. If you did the same way I did all the metal, all the straps in metal, but then the larger buckles that clamp down in and around it are painted in the same color as the camo pattern. So block everything else in as Mechanica Standard Gray. All right, and with the Mechanica Standard Gray blocked in on the fuel tanks, as we can see here, it's a great accent color that's a little bit more neutral compared to the corn red, so it doesn't pop as much. So the last color we have to do is white. For this, I'll be using Trooper White from Two Thin Coats from Duncan Rhodes Painting Academy. Got a little bit on my wet palette here, and what we want to paint white is any of the Imperial symbology. So we have this skull and wing for the Astra Militarum on the front here. Get that blocked in. And other things that we will want to call out might be things such as the skulls back here on the fuel tanks, or once again, the skulls and wings even on the tailpipes. The last step that we're going to do before applying washes is to put texture mud paint on the treads of our vehicle and along the bottom of the armored plates. For this, I start out with Vallejo Thick Mud Acrylic. This is a reddish brown diorama effect that they have. It's a textured paint. It's got grit and bits of stuff inside of the paint itself. But if you don't have this, there are a few alternatives. Two of the alternatives that you could use is the dirt texture paste from Huge Miniatures. I do recommend this one, or you can use Sterling Mud from Games Workshop. Both of these will be great alternatives, and you can apply them in nearly the same way. So what you want to do is start out with your pigment here and get a really old brush. So I got an old wash brush from GW. You can see is just pretty beat up. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to get just a little bit of this texture paint on the end, and I'm going to begin to apply it somewhat liberally across the model. Now, these are pretty large treads here as well. So as I'm applying this, you do want to make sure you get some chunks and bits. See that where you can see some of the texture that's coming off and through the paint. You want to make sure you get that on there, and you're not putting it on so thin that it's only a color. You do want to make sure, like, see, I got some mud there on the end. All right, look at that. Yep, okay. But we want to leave some of the track, some of the tread still exposed on this. We don't want to cover the whole thing up. So it's going to start out with this reddish brown. It's going to be kind of ugly, but later on in the next phase, when we do our washes, it'll really tone this down and bring it into a nice dark brown. So just continue to apply this. The other thing that you'll want to do with this paint is, besides getting it onto the tracks, get it into your wheel housing in here like that. And then you want to splash some of it up on the bottom here, along with some of the chunks, right? Like mud has splashed up onto the armored panels of the vehicle. So, like I said, don't want it so thin. You want some of the grit on there. There we go. So you'll lose some of your detail of the model here, but you're going to create that effect you've been rolling across the muddy battlefield. Here we go. All So just continue that around, and then you'll need to leave it to dry for a little while. So don't do the bottom, so you can actually set it down and not glue it to your table. And then we'll come back after it's all dry and done. So I skipped a step, so we're doing a little bit of a time jump in this video, but it shouldn't be of any concern. So what we're going to do next is place on decals. I'm going to go ahead and select the decals that came with the kit. So you can see here I'm using the number 1s, and I have several other Cadian emblems and warning symbols and so forth. I have another set over here because I am painting 2 of these at the same time. So to apply your decals, what I would recommend doing is take your decals, soak them into some nice clean water, to go ahead and loosen them from the transfer sheet. Wouldn't do all of them at once because sometimes it can dry up and then your decal won't slide off. So I'm going to do several here at the same time though. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to do is get some micro set and micro sol. I highly recommend this for decals. This gives you a much better application that is smoother and is more matte in the end, although we will still go over this with a matte finish. So what you'll want to do, take a nice clean brush like I have here, dip it into your micro set, and then apply that where you're going to put your decals. Now the reason I'm saying, even though this video you may see a time jump, I have shade on it now and I may not have shade on it in a moment, the reason it doesn't matter much for me is I don't really usually place my decals near the edges or the recesses where I would put the transfers. So no harm, no foul if you skip the step the same way I did. All right, next step is I'm going to take my tweezers, remove my decal, and then apply it where I've just put down my micro set. So I'm going to line it up and make sure it's nice and even. Don't push down too hard with your tweezers because you can rip and tear your decals. They are very, very thin. All right, first one's down. Next one. It's down as well. Goes down nice and easy. So I'm going to line these up to be between the toe hooks here. All right, look at that. I got both of my Cadian gate symbols in place. So what microset's going to do is allow the decal to actually sit flush onto the model. This is especially important for if your model has curved surfaces where you want to be placing your decals. Later on, I'll be placing decals back here on these 2 little hatches, and I'll be using the little caution triangle there. I'll also be placing vent decals right here next to these 2 air intakes. So with that, at least that's what I think these are. They're right above the engine compartment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead, go around, place my decals on my vehicle. Make sure not to touch them yet. So keep your fingers away from the ones you've just applied, or you will slide them right off of your model. After applying all of our decals using micro set to place the decals over top of, now we're going to move on to the next step, which is applying micro sol. So micro sol is a softening solution that actually takes the decals and adheres them into place and allows them to mold to the surface in which you've applied them to. Now it's going to be a difficult one to show off, but this is what I have. So with the 2 triangular warning signs that I put over top of these rounded caps, as you can see right there, they're not sitting flush over top of the cap. So what I'm going to want to do is take my micro sol with a nice soft brush, get some on there, and gently apply it to the decal, trying not to move it in the process. Now you want to wait until your micro set has completely dried before applying your micro sol. Oops. So if you're not careful, you can move the decal, but don't worry, just take it, take your pliers, shift it back into place nice and gently. Here we go. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and wait for this to dry completely and then apply another coat if needed. I will continue to apply coats of micro sol and let it dry until my decal has softened and adhered to the surface the way I want it to. You can also go ahead and apply some micro sol to some of the decals that you've already applied over the flat surfaces, although this isn't always necessary. I like to do it just to make sure that my decals are sitting nice and flat on my model. So you can see all the ones I've done here. I've done the Cadian gate, Cadian symbol, The number here, just as an interesting fact about how I do my models, is the number in which I paint this specific range of models. So this is my very first Rogal Dorn, so I've placed the number 1 on it. I've placed the number 2 on the secondary one off camera that I'm also painting. You can notice that on all of my artillery models and Lahmian Russes that I already own as well. What I've done for the new Sentinel kits and for the new artillery kits is I've put the number on the crew's shoulder pad for their unit insignia. All right, so there's everything I've applied. I'm going to let that dry, probably do 1 or 2 more coats of microsol, and then we'll move on to the next step. Honestly, I was a bit surprised. After a single coat of microsol, my hazard triangles actually flattened out perfectly over top of those domes. So now we can move on to the next step. What we'll want to do is apply a pigmentless medium to our decals. And this is going to be Lahmian medium here. So this is a clear medium paint that Games Workshop makes. And that's it. There's just no color to it. But what that'll do is 2 things. It'll hold our decals in place, and it'll actually remove any of the edges around the decal. The paint will self-level over top of the decal a little bit, creating a nice smooth transition so you don't see the edges. So I've mixed my paint up fairly well, get a little bit on my brush, come down over here, and then just apply a little over all of my decals. That's it. My Lahmian medium is getting a little older though, as you can see there, so I'm going to water it down a little bit, thin that out. I was getting a little gloopy, which is all right. I'm going to hit all this later with a nice heavy matte finish, and that'll cover up any of those glossy streaks or anything else. Plus, you can always take that as an opportunity to add some cool chipping and wearing to your model. So, screw around the model, add your Lahmian medium to it. In this part of the tutorial, we'll begin applying washes to our Rogal Dorn. So in this step, we'll actually want to remove the turret so that we can make sure we get into all the recesses. There we go, and all the components of our tank. For this, we're also going to need, I'm going to be using 2 brushes, and this is what I recommend, both the medium and the large shade brushes from Citadel. So we'll be using the large shade on the tracks in the bottom of the tank. Then we'll be using the medium shade to do our recess washes in and around. So we'll be washing this 2 different ways, both with a recess and with just a general wash. So here's what I want to do. We want to get our Agrax Earthshade, shake it up really well, because you want to make sure this is not separated. If it's separated, you could get a glossy finish or even a white kind of finish where the medium of the paint and the pigments itself begin to separate. So take your medium brush, get plenty of shade on there, and what we want to do is begin applying that liberally over the tracks. So also, when we do this, we want to go a little bit beyond the mud we've already put down. Go out beyond that here. So see how I'm doing that there? Make sure to get in those recesses a little bit, push it around, go up beyond, but make sure it's also not clean and neat on the edges either, right? Splash it up there a little bit. Get it in and around there. We're going to need more. This takes a lot of shade to do it this way. Make sure it doesn't pull up. Distribute around. Also do the bottom of the tank this way. Get all of the mud we've done down at the bottom and along the tracks. And also apply the shade liberally down there. So here you can see we're starting to get everything kind of shaded. As well, the other thing that we want to do is, as we're shading this, right, as we're applying it through here, go ahead and stipple it up a little bit up above where we already have applied the mud. Just speckle it up in there like that. There we go. Okay. All right. There we go. And then we'll just continue this all the way around, getting it on all the tracks along the bottom of the plates. You want to speckle it up here, the back of the tank as well. Don't worry, I know this isn't pretty. It's not going to look nice yet, but once we apply our other steps, this will all come together. Next, we're going to begin doing recessed washes across the model. What I've done is with my medium shade brush or my large shade brush, I've covered both the exhaust area here. Oop, missed a little part there. So let me quickly cover it up while it's still wet. So we've got the exhaust, all the treads have stippled upward across here. So you can see we're beginning to create this kind of dirt pattern along the model. We're actually going to be covering most of this up later, but it's going to help create a nice transition. So what we want to do next is use our medium shade brush or whatever brush you might prefer to apply your shades in large quantities like this. And here's what we want to do. We want to apply this to all the metallics on the weapons except for the multi-meltas. So do everything except the multi-meltas when it comes to the weapons. So we'll start here with the heavy bolters. And then we're going to go around the vehicle. You can see I'm being pretty liberal about this. Just applying that everywhere. Okay. So then we'll want to go around the model. And we want to get things such as the Imperial symbols we've painted white. We want to get all the little recesses like down in here. You don't have to worry about being too neat about it, because we will come back later and clean a lot of this up with our dry brushing too. We don't want to be too excessive, right? You can see here I'm being a little neat around the rivets, getting each little one of those. I'm going to be neat around a little detail here where the hull-mounted gun comes in, and so forth. So we're just going to go around the model. Get every single one of those rivets, every single one of those creases and recesses. Apply our shade into them. Don't forget as you're working on this to get things such as the ropes and cover those entirely. Get the metals here on the crates, get around the edges, the wood on your crates, and don't forget to get down into the recesses. If you want, you can do what I just did there. Take your finger and wipe off any extra you may have gotten on the model. Just then be aware you have shade on your hand, so be careful what you touch next. The next step after applying our texture paint, wash, and decals is to do our dry brushing. Now, we could sit here and edge highlight this entire model, and that is a valid way to paint this and get a really great result. However, my preferred method, I wanted it to look good, and I want to get it on the tabletop. So I choose to dry brush my model. So with this, I'm going to be using two paints to do the camouflage. So first I'm going to be doing Screaming Skull. Alternatively, you could do Ushabti Bone. You can see there is a decent difference in color tone there. But I use Screaming Skull because it provides for that nice bright edge. And then the other color I'm going to use is Nurgling Green. So this is on the tan and on the green for the model. After we apply these two dry brushes, we'll do another set of dry brushes for the mud. So let's start out with Screaming Skull. Give it a nice good shake. Get a dry brush here. I get the medium dry brush from Games Workshop. Apply a little to your brush. Now, I got a piece of fabric here. I like to use old shirts and so forth. So I'm going to get this to where I get most of the moisture away, but not so much that it's just flaking everywhere. And then I'm going to begin to just apply this around the model. So look at that there. So it's providing a nice highlight, but it's not chalky. So this is about the perfect consistency that you want when doing your dry brush. So I'm going to go around to be careful to only hit the tan areas of my model. I'm going to go back and forth, whichever way I need to, in order to get the dry brush highlight applied where I want it to the model. Now, it's okay if you get areas like this where I've rubbed off some of my dry brushing on here. I think later on when I go back and add the texturing and the weathering to the model, it'll help to create some good tonal shift in the model and make it look like there are other kind of worn or different textured surfaces kind of happening across the model, which will kind of add to the weathering some. For our next step, we may want to clean up some of the highlights we've done, whether for a couple of different reasons. First, you may not have been able to get into some of the recesses or crevices of the model with your dry brush without making a mess. You also may want to clean up some of the edges of the armor here, or over along the edge to create a much finer highlight. So I'm going to get in there, clean a few of these up, and then we'll move on to the next step. To clean these up, what we'll want to do is just take our highlight paints and get a very small brush. So I'm using a 2-0 from Red Grass Games. I really love their brushes. So we're going to try that out here. All right. Get a little nerdling green, put it on our wet palette, thin it down. Okay, so what I want to do is get in here and highlight some of the edges that we might have missed with our dry brush. So I'm just going to go around, pick a few of these out, maybe even enhance a few of the highlights that we did get. So like over here on this light, didn't get those too well. Get in here and clean those up a little bit. Give a little brighter edge too. Now this is just the first step in cleaning up some of our dry brushing, which did help us get our model together a little quicker. So we will have a couple more steps to go. As part of our cleaning up of the highlights, the other thing we're going to do is take some of this nurgling green that we have on our wet palette, and we're going to go over to the crate and that we've placed on the stowage there of the vehicle, and we're going to finely edge highlight this. The dry brushing probably just couldn't catch it quite the same as what this edge highlight can do. The other thing that we're going to do is, if you notice, I've streaked a little bit of dryad bark on here. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to edge highlight around it real fine some of this nurgling green in order to make it look like the wood has been chipped. So just take little pieces of dryad bark, paint, which is a kind of medium brown tone, but it's different than our mud. Apply it on there. As we work around, we'll be able to make it look like this wooden box has been dinged up. While we're at it also, we'll go ahead and highlight all the seams. For our next step of cleaning up our highlights, we're going to be using some Screaming Skull from Games Workshop. Same thing we dry brushed for the tan. Put a little bit on our wet palette here. Then we're going to apply it around some of the finer detail that our dry brush did not pick up. Just go around these panels, cleaning up any of these lines you want. Now, of course, this is an optional step. You do not have to go back in and clean up these highlights. This is just something that I prefer to do. Now, another thing to note is notice how I'm not being too clean. This is for two different purposes. One, I want to make this model look nice, but I want to get it on the table. Second, is that we'll be coming back through here in a little bit with our weathering effects and our dry brushing for the dirt, and it'll actually cover up some of our defects. Or that can be a moment where you can take your chipping and weathering and use that to hide some of the flaws in your paint job. So don't worry about perfection here. It's a vehicle that has seen many days of battle in the 41st millennium. So let's treat it as such. So get that paint on here. Get those highlights neatened up the way you want them. Then we'll move on with doing our weathering. There we go. Other thing to note when using your Screaming Skull, come over here to your sandbags. I've painted mine Xandri dust, so I'm actually just going to highlight these up. Okay, find all the little seams on your sandbags. Get them all highlighted, right? Bring those lines out off of here. And basically treat it like it's fabric, right? And even create seams sometimes where there aren't any. See, like that. Create some seams. And that will help give some life to the details on your model. Okay, we have one last highlight to do before we enter into our cleanup phase before dry brushing and weathering. We're going to be using some Dawn Stone here to highlight the fuel tanks on the back that I've done in Mechanicus Standard Gray. So we are going to edge highlight these, so I've put some Dawn Stone onto my wet palette. And then I'm applying it nice and neat around the edges of these barrels. Now, something to note on the barrels, we do have these upper portions here, so do try to carefully get a nice thin line down both sides. Don't worry if you make any small mistakes, because we'll be able to come back through, add chipping and weathering later, and we can cover up any of those mistakes we've made along the way with that. The next step before weathering is a cleanup phase. This is optional as well. I like to do this to clean up anything that maybe I'm not happy with when it came to the washes, dry brushes, and highlights. So we'll get back out our Castellan green and our Xandri dust. We'll get a little bit on our wet palette. And then just wherever you want to, you can come in and begin cleaning up anything on the model that you are not happy with the results. So right here, I got a highlight that's a little thick. I got a wash that seems to have gone out of a crease. And I'm just going to put a little Castellan green and get rid of any of those things that I don't want there. I got a little smudge there I don't want, right? Oh, that dry brush on top of that. It's a little too much. So I'm going to get rid of that. Right, so just go around the model with these two colors, clean up anything that you're unhappy with, and then we'll move on to our weathering next. Next, we're going to be highlighting the leather straps on our stowage across the model. So we have here with the rope, we have here with some of the fabric and cloth that's rolled up. So anywhere we have leather on our stowage, we want to take a little bit of Scrag Brown from Games Workshop. We want to put it onto our wet palette. Using a nice fine brush, I'm using my 2-0 from Redgrass Games. We want to just highlight up those edges there. See, just like that, nice and neat. And so we're going to go around, give all these a nice little edge highlight on all of these straps. Now, another thing you can do to go ahead and start texturing this is you could take your edge and just create these little lines that make the leather look like it's been bent and worn a little bit, right? That the leather's cracking, just like that. So you can go ahead and do that with this color also. The next step that's optional is we can take Deathclaw Brown from Games Workshop and do a final highlight. So get a little bit of that on your wet palette with a nice fine tip brush. And what you'll want to do is find the highest areas on the leather and just give them a nice little final highlight there. You can also do a little bit of stress on the leather around the edges. See that there? So we can add just like a little bit of lines. So once again, looks like the leather's worn out a little bit, just to add some texture that may not be there on the model. It's a great way to help bring your model to life. There we go. So we're just going to go around all the leather and just hit it here at its highest spots. Next, we're going to highlight the wood that is also on our stowage. So I'm using Gorthor Brown and then Baneblade Brown. Although you could use a brighter tan color as well after your Gorthor Brown in order to create that nice highlight on the wood. So what we're going to do, get a little bit of this on your wet palette. We're going to start with the Gorthor Brown. And over top of the things that we've painted dryad bark, like the handles of our tools, we're just going to add some texture in here. So draw lines that are not generally straight. They should weave and flow a little bit across the elements. There we go, just like that. It's going to be very subtle, so you're not going to be able to see much of it. But then the brighter color, like the Baneblade Brown, will bring more of it out. Now the other thing I've done is add a little bit of dryad bark to the crate to create it, to make it look like it's had some damage. So we're going to add a little bit of the Gorthor Brown in those damage creases as well. We can also use it to create some marks of further damage along the box, just like I'm doing here. Good. This way it makes it look like there's deeper gashes and more shallow gashes. Next, take a little bit of that Baneblade Brown or that brighter tan. Go ahead and add a few more highlights. For your wooden tools, get them around the edges, the highest parts there, and add it kind of sporadically through the handles, like so. For the next step of our process, we'll be sponging on the weathering, the chipping effects to the Rogal Dorn. So what we're using here is a piece of foam that has been ripped up and made uneven on its edges here. As you can see, it's dimpled in and out and tore it up pretty good. Just took this out of one of my battle foam cases. And we'll also be using two different colors, but starting out with Rhinox hide. So this will be the more rust-like chipping effect that we'll be placing onto the model, and then we'll be covering up in a moment with a metallic color. So what we'll want to do is give our Rhinox hide a good shake, open it up, dabble some of it onto the sponge, like so, but then take a dry cloth, like this, and begin to dry off our sponge some. Alright, so this is what we're looking at now, right? We could dab it a few more times. So how you're looking to apply this to places where you believe, especially incoming fire, would be striking the model, or places where people would be rubbing off the paint and chipping away at it, such as spots they might be walking over, the tread guards, or elsewhere on the model. So take your sponge and then apply it lightly over where you want it on the model. The reason we're going to do lightly is because you can always come back and add more, but it's harder to take away. We've already added a lot of detail to the model. The other thing that you can do with this chipping effect is cover up any areas that you're not happy with the outcome of, right? Right there, down here like that. I don't really quite like how that turned out. So we can go around on the various pieces of our model and just cover some stuff up. Don't worry about things being sacred. Like, look, I'm going to hit that skull a little bit, chip it up. And that's quite all right. All right, then we'll do the same thing to our actual model. I'll chip a little there. Try to miss your sandbags, rope, and other fabric and leathers, right? We don't want to be chipping those, but don't be afraid to hit your decals. It's okay if those look a little beat up too. So I'm going to go around, adding some of this chipping to the model, and then we'll be back when we add the metallics. Next, we're going to sponge on some Leadbelcher using our dry sponge here. So pick a dry side. I've already dried out the Rhinox side, but if you haven't done that, you can use the other side as well. So we'll be applying this on here very lightly over top of the existing Rhinox hide. This is to create the effect that the paint has been chipped away and now even some of the metal is now exposed underneath. So pop open your Leadbelcher and go ahead and apply some to your sponge, and then we're going to dry it off on our towel. Now make sure when you're doing this you do dry it off just a little bit more than we did with the Rhinox hide, because we do want to be applying this just more lightly so that it doesn't take over and it doesn't apply to a greater surface than the Rhinox hide had done. So go ahead and grab your model, come over here and just lightly dab over top of where we already have our Rhinox hide. There we go, just a little bit there. Okay, it's a little bit hard to see because of the reflectiveness of the paint and the light, but if you look there, you can see where the Rhinox hide is still covering a greater surface area than the Leadbelcher, but the Leadbelcher is starting to add to that weathering effect to make it look like the paint has been chipped away. So we will continue to go around the model, adding our Leadbelcher over top of our Rhinox hide, just a little bit of a time. You can even pinch the sponge a little differently if need be in order to get it into those more precise areas. So just go around and get this applied nice and evenly over top of your Rhinox hide. Also, remember that it's better to add just a little bit at a time here, because it's very difficult to take this away once it's added to the model. So if you just apply it lightly, pull your model away, look at it for a moment and verify you've applied enough to it, then you can go back and add a little bit more if you feel it's necessary, rather than having to go back and re-base coat and then re-weather again. Our next weathering effect will be adding dried mud around the edges where our tracks are and splashing up along the bottom of the model. So to do this, we're going to need two things. We're going to need a dry brush. I'm going to use the large dry brush from Citadel. You could also use the medium one, or you could use those rounded makeup brushes. Those work really well too. And then we're going to start with Steel Legion Drab. So give this a good shake. In case you're wondering why mine are making a rattling sound, I've put mixing balls inside of my Citadel paint pots. All right, so get some paint onto your brush and then begin, as you can see there, I've come about a fourth of the way down the bristles, and then begin drying it off on your dry towel. So work it around in there. You want it to be what I like to call a little saturated surface dry, right? You don't want all the moisture out because you don't want to be flaking bits of pigment everywhere. You want to make sure that it still applies the color onto the model. So begin applying it over it. You can see I'm kind of brushing horizontally and gently. You can already see how it's picking up on the surface there and creating that tonal shift in our now darkened mud because of our Agrax Earthshade over that red-brown mud there. So with the Steel Legion, we're going to apply it in and around over top of all of our dark mud areas. As you can see here, just going around on the treads and the wheelhouses, getting in there to make sure that we get all of our highlights in. As well, we're going to come up above where our dark brown mud is and begin applying it there, slowly building up the shift in color up above. This is to give the impression that there is dried mud coming up the side of the armor of the tank. So go along through there, get in between all of your raised areas. And if you look real close, you can see that that is just starting to build up there. So you may have to do this a few times with a few different coats in order to get the depth of color you want. Remember, it's good to apply just a little bit, set your model down, take a look at it, See if it's as much as you want, and if not, you can always add a little more. But if you add too much, it's harder to correct that. So we've gone ahead and loaded our brush back up again. We're going to begin dry brushing over top of that area once again to start building up that effect across the bottom of the armor there. We're going to apply it to the back of the treads here, get those going up along the sides there. See, we're going to do the same effect up on top of the track guards and on the side of any of the armor. Basically, think about it like the mud is splashing up, and there's also the thinner pieces of mud that may be becoming dust and settling upon the armor there. So this will make even more sense when we come in with the next set of highlights to help clean that up even more and give it the effect of the dried mud fading along the armor. Now we're really starting to build up our coat here, and you can see the impact that it's having. Well, as soon as the camera gets back in focus. Hey, there we go. And so you can see that Steel Legion drab now starting to build up along the bottom of the model and up along the upper areas too. So we're going to keep working our way around to build this color up the way we want to in and around our tracks and our muddy areas. For the last part of doing the mud effect, we're going to take Ushabti bone and we're going to dry brush it on using our same dry brush. Now this time, we want to be careful because, right, we're building up layers, so we don't want to push our dry brush down into the cracks or anything. We really just want to hit the top. So hopefully we get all 3 tones of mud. We get the deeper dark mud we got from the Vallejo mixed with the Agrax Earthshade, and then we'll get the Steel Legion drab, and then we'll also see some Ushabti bone. Now as well, I want to just show you this real quick. You can see here where we've built up the Steel Legion drab, almost to the point that some of the Ushabti bone on the lower part begins to go away in this kind of brown color. You can also see it back here, where it's built up over top of the track guard, right? That's the level of dry brush that you want, where it begins to create a tonal shift in color. This is a great example too, where you can see the mud has been stacked up in kind of layers. We got thick, chunky wet mud down below, a little bit drier, just a little bit drier, more tan mud up here, and then we're going to add those nice dry brush highlights. We've also done the bottom all around, and this way when we go to do this, we need to make sure that we do high brush highlight and dry brush all of those parts. So all right, we got our Ushabti bone mixed up. Get a little bit on our brush. All right, and work a lot of that out of our bristles. Here we go. All right, so let's start somewhere it's a little less conspicuous to make sure we have the right amount of paint that we want on our dry brush. Let's start at the bottom. Oh, look at it. That's pretty much perfect. See how that's just beginning to take some of, like, it doesn't take away the Steel Legion drab or any of the other tones in the mud here. We do just want to hit the tops of it and create these nice little highlights. All right. Yeah, that looks wonderful. Okay. Over here, go ahead and just give everything just a real general highlight of Ushabti bone. But as we get done with that, like a nice little highlight, come up just a little bit above that line of the Steel Legion drab, and do our circles again. In this way, there's almost this dry kind of dust effect just above it. Don't cover up the Steel Legion, just a little bit beyond it. See, like right there? Just a little bit beyond it, and kind of create that shift. And so we can see where we have wet mud, medium tone, and then dry dirt kind of stacked up on our vehicle as it drives along all of the battlefields and continues to fight for the Emperor. At least you better be fighting for the Emperor. All right, we'll continue around until we get all that done. Now we're on to the final details of the model. Here we'll just be finishing up a few of the colors and blocking in some of our highlights and so forth on some of the smaller details. First, we're going to do the red lenses. So for this, you're going to need Corn Red, Evil Sun Scarlet, Troll Slayer Orange, Tau Ochre, Tau Light Ochre,
and then Pallid Witch Flesh. Now, you could substitute this for any number of other colors you have, or mix your colors in order to get the tones you want, but I think this is a good 5-tier stepping stone in order to obtain the effect that I'm going to show you today. So we're going to need corn red to go ahead and repair some of the overlap we've done with our highlights and so forth over the lenses we've already painted. In addition, don't forget, we did wash this with Agrax Earthshade. So what that has done is darken down the corn red, and we want to brighten it up, but don't paint into the recesses. Leave those shadows created by the shade in there. So we're going to go around. See that? Just getting that covered in corn red again. All right. So we have the three lenses on the turret weapon, but then we also have 3 lenses on the turret itself. 2 in the same spot, 1 over here on the side. Go ahead and get the one on the side. See, we're just brightening it up, but not getting into those recesses. For this one here, what I would recommend is painting in diagonal lines down like this, and then skipping the bottom corner. And then here, same thing as the other rounded lens. Okay. Next, we want to move on to our Evil Sun Scarlet. For this, what we're going to want to do on our rounded lenses, we're going to want to create kind of like a highlight, but it's going to be bigger as it gets closer to the rounded part in the middle of the lens. So we want to do it along the top like this. All right. So if you can see that there, we've rounded that out and we've kind of created almost like an edge highlight, but it gets a little thicker in the middle there. There we go. Okay. So we're going to do that around all of our lenses. And then we're going to move on to Troll Slayer Orange. For Troll Slayer Orange, what we want to do is highlight that up. The Evil Sun Scarlet we've already done. Coming in just a little bit further and just getting the middle of it. Okay. Just like that. So now we're creating this kind of glare effect on the lens. Then we come back in with our Tau Light Ochre, and we want to then just get our kind of final highlight almost. All right. So you can see that there. We got it layered up. Then you can do one of 2 things here with the final highlight, which is the Pallid Witch Flesh. I never use a true white. I always use an off-white for these things. So what you'll want to do is one of 2 things. You'll definitely want to come down here to the bottom corner and create a lens glare effect just by putting a little dot into the corner of the lens. You could also do it up here on top of the Tau Ochre light if you want to. Just a nice, subtle little dot. There we go. And with that, a lens would be complete. So we'll go around, paint them all that way. Let's do this one on the turret real quick, because I do paint it a little different. So once again, Evil Sun Scarlet, we're going to come in at an angle, come down, and we want to stop just above where we had just brightened up our corn red. All right. Then we want to come in with Troll Slayer Orange and highlight that up just a little bit more. Notice how I'm doing like a little bit of a highlight on the outer edge of this too, just to kind of add to it, add some interest to it. All right, Tau Light Ochre. I want to come in just along. This is really an edge highlight. See that there? So that's what we've done with the Tau Light Ochre. Then come in once again with our Pallid Witch Flesh, and here's what I'd recommend. Put a dot in the bottom corner, and also come in and do a nice little highlight right there at the very peak of that. So if I got that in focus, you can see both of those. And there we go. That's how we'll paint the lenses on our vehicles. Our next step will be finishing up the spotlight that we've started here on our turret. So we've covered it with Averland Sunset Yellow, and then we've also washed it with Agrax Earthshade. So it's got kind of a dirty look already. It doesn't need to appear to be on. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to take some of this Gryphe-Hound orange contrast paint. You could also use an orange wash if you haven't. I still have an old pot of Fugan orange, and that also would work well. But take your contrast paint here if that's what you have, or you could thin down an existing orange if you want to. I might recommend, let's say, probably Caro orange or one of those colors. So, right, try something out if you don't have this, or go pick up a pot. All right, so I've got a little bit on my brush. I'm going to water it down just a little bit because I don't want it too strong. So we get a tiny bit of water on my water pot, mix it in with this. All right, so what I want to do is just go along the bottom of my light, right, the lower portion of the light, and apply this orange contrast paint. So about the bottom half. Oops, just like that. There we go. Next, we're going to take a brighter yellow, such as Yriel yellow, put it on our wet palette, and we're going to use this to highlight the very top of the spotlight. So we want to get up here and just get a little bit just along the upper reaches of the spotlight, as if it's refracting light back out of it. So with that, we now have 3 tones of color across that spotlight. Now, if you get unhappy with any of this, you can just go back to Airbrushing Sunset. It's a great base color. Cover this up and just kind of rework it as you deem necessary. I actually think I'm going to bring the orange part down just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and do that myself. Take a little Airbrushing Sunset. Get it on my wet palette. All right, got it to the consistency I want. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to clean it up a little bit. There we go. I'm a little more happier with that. Okay. Next, we're going to take some more Leadbelcher, and now we're going to paint the wire frame over the spotlight. So come in here with a medium layer brush, or a nice brush you can keep control of, and just slowly highlight over top on your spotlight. And once you start breaking up this yellow and orange color shift, you can begin to see how this can tie together the light in such a way that makes it look like there are areas catching light and areas not catching light on the spotlight that may be off. I don't like to paint my spotlights on because anymore in this version of the game, we don't often use spotlights with rules anymore. So it used to be in older editions we had that, but so there you go. You can see that there. So that's it. Nice simple spotlight. You could take it further, add more colors to it if you want. This is a great way to get a nice, good working spotlight done. There you go. Next step will be painting the viewports on the tank. There are several of these. There's some around the cupolas or the hatches and ports of the turret. There are also some on the side of the tank here. So for this, we'll be using Rust Gray, Vanresian Gray, and Ulthman Gray. All right, get a little bit of these on your wet palette, and what we want to do is get into the top left corner of those windows, and we just want to block in a little triangle. All right. It's hard for me to get this tiny detail in the camera and where I can actually look at it and paint it. There we go. Okay. So after you've painted that little triangle in the corner, what we want to do next is go to our Vanresian Gray and paint a smaller triangle within that triangle. There we go. Next, we want to take some of our Ulthman Gray, and we want to do 2 things. One, we want to put a little dot in this corner. We put a little dot down here in the bottom. There we go. Now, for the main windows on the body of the tank, we won't want to paint a triangle about halfway up the way we did with the other one. So what we'll want to do is actually come Let's see. What we want to do is come to about here with our triangle. So about 2/3 of the way down, and also about 2/3 of the way across with that triangle. Okay, as you can see there, I've got that triangle started. Then do the same thing. Take our Fenrisian gray, after we've got our rust gray in there, take the Fenrisian gray and make a smaller triangle. Then finally, take some of your Ulthwane gray. You want to get a little dot in the bottom corner there, and you'll also want to get a little edge highlight, a little line up here in the top corner of that window. And there you have it. That's what it should look like when it's all done.
For the second to last step, we'll be applying weathering pigments and weathering powders to the model. So for my tank models, what I like to do is only apply one thing. I'm going to use this now out of production Exhaust Black Weather Pigment from Secret Weapons Miniatures. They did discontinue this line, unfortunately. This is actually my favorite one, and I still have plenty of it left. This stuff can last you a very long time. But plenty of other people make also wonderful pigments. For example, here I have a bunch from Huge Miniatures. So I have Gunmetal, I have Earth Color, I have a Patina Color, another thing of Earth Color. I got two of the same one. But anyhow, you can get these from multiple companies. Huge Miniatures is another company I really like. Now, these are weathering powders, and you can also just buy straight up pigments. They do act a little bit differently and have different qualities. Not by much, but usually one has a little bit more of a binder in it, is a little stronger, and will actually stick to your model. Whereas in plain pigments, right, rather than a weathering powder like just a straight pigment, won't have a binder, and you will have to seal it on. So this is why this is the second to last step, because the last thing we're going to do is coat our model in a matte varnish to prevent any of this from coming off. You do not want to use pigments unless you're going to seal the model. Do not use them unless you're going to seal the model, unless it's a display model you're going to sit on a shelf and never touch. In that case, have at it, because there's no risk if you're not going to touch it and rub it away. So what we want to do is to create carbon soot effects on a number of elements of our model, such as the tips of the weapons, right, the barrels, and also the exhaust ports here on the Rogal Dorn. Now, another thing you can do with weathering pigments, which is very common, especially on a model such as this, you can do streaks of grime and soot and weathering. You could add it to the track area or various parts of the model in order to create the idea that dirt, mud, and soot has landed, in the various creases and crevices. You could even make washes out of pigments if you wanted to. Today, we're going to keep it simple, and we're applying it to create the carbon soot effect on various elements such as exhaust and the weapons ports. So let's get started. You want to lay down a nice clean sheet of paper or some other type of surface to work on. Pigments get messy and they will get everywhere. So you have to have a way to clean this up easily. So what I recommend, just getting a regular sheet of paper, laying it down and working off this. Be also aware of where you place things, because pigments will get on this and you don't want to drag these things through the pigment and then scatter the pigment everywhere. Other thing I recommend is actually some gloves. The reason being, pigments can be attracted to the oils that we naturally generate on our skin, so you can get fingerprint looking weather pigments on your models if you're not careful. I'm also using a number 3 old brush I have. The bristles are not in the best of shape anymore. They're all right, but I'm going to use this for brushing on my pigments. So I'm not using a fine detail brush or anything. I'm actually using something of some moderate value so I can get those spread on quickly. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to carefully, because this stuff can fly everywhere, open up our pigments, get a little bit on our brush, okay? See that? So it's kind of thick right now. Then what I want to do actually is, you can do one of two ways. You can apply it directly on the model. Let's do that first. So I'm going to take this barrel here, And I'm going to start by kind of spreading this around a little bit. There we go. Getting it on the barrel. Now see how I'm doing this over the paper, so I can pick up the excess that falls off and apply it back to the surface that I want it on. Another thing to note, I don't know if my camera is high enough quality picking it up. These pigments are going airborne. I can actually see the dust of them in the air as I apply them. I'm saying this gets very messy, so make sure you are planning for that or accounting for it accordingly. All right. So, look at that, how it has created this effect of like as if you were firing a weapon and it was carbon-based projectile, right? You got gunpowder in there or something, and so you get that kind of burnt or carbon soot effect there on the tips of your barrels. So I'm going to do this for both the main cannon and the auto cannon over here. About time for me to add some more pigment, so spread that back. Another thing to note about working with pigment this way, so I'm doing a dry application. There are many ways of doing pigments. So the dry application like this, you want to be careful not to rub it off, because well, you're going to have to seal it. The other thing that's going to happen is when we apply our sealer, some of the tonal value may be toned down. This may actually reduce. So you'll want to create a gradient effect coming from front to back on these things, and then actually apply a little bit more than what you think you need. So make it a little darker than you think is necessary. Reason being is once we apply the way I'm going to do it, a matte varnish through an airbrush, although you can also apply it with a brush too, but I'm going to be using an airbrush for this demonstration. It'll actually thin this down, and it won't be as significant of an impact in the end. All right, there we go. Let's get that a little bit on there. All right, so we're going to go around each weapon, each little exhaust port, apply it that way. The other thing you do, say like weapons like this, right? The little mini demolisher barrel here. I'm going to actually apply my pigments down here on the paper first, and then come back up and apply it to my barrel. And that's also an okay way to do it. It helps you control, because I don't have a lot of pigment on my brush. It helps you control the amount you're applying, prevents you from making a mess or putting on more than you intended. If you do put on more than you intended, guess what? You haven't sealed it yet. You can quickly rub it away. All right. See that? All right. Now a little bit of the metallics are still showing through. I actually want to get a little more pigment on there, because like I said, once I apply the varnish, it's going to take some of that away, right? It's going to activate it by applying moisture to it. And so we want to make sure we have some extra on there. There we go. We'll do the same thing with the Punisher Gatling cannon. I'm actually going to do a direct application on the end. Look at that. Looks good. Okay. Try to sit that down. Nice and neat. So continue doing our weapons. Now on the exhaust, here's what I recommend. We're going to do direct application right on the ends of the exhaust ports. And then we want to come up. We got these little holes here, and I imagine that as the exhaust comes out, if you know anything about the aerodynamics of vehicles, oftentimes it's usually an air current that brings things back around over top of a vehicle while it moves. So with that, I would imagine that the carbon soot would come upward on top of this heat shield. So we want to apply some up here as well, and that'll work out well with the Agrax Earthshade we've already applied. Now I don't want it too significant, so I'm actually going to rub off a little bit on the Aquillas there, because I still want those visible. I'm also going to apply a little bit to these intake vents. Not much, but just a little bit. There we go. Look at that. What do you think? I think it looks good. It'll be toned down when I apply the matte varnish, so it's not too much right now. It'll really help blend it in with the Agrax Earthshade below, and it's not too much on these intake vents either. I didn't take away the camo pattern, and still a few of the little highlights are showing through as well. The other spot you'll want to apply this to, besides all the other weapons that we have available, is to the ends of your smoke launchers as well, if you want to do that. I think it's a great little thing to do. And then make sure you get all your weapons. The only weapons I'm not applying it to is for the tips of my melta weapons, which I've painted in this heat stressed pattern there. So those I won't be applying any to the tips. All right, so we'll continue this and then we'll come back with getting them sealed up. For our last step, we're going to seal in all of our work on the model using varnish. For this, I recommend using a matte varnish. It's just the preferred way I like painting my Astra Militarum. Here I'm going to be using Winsor & Newton matte varnish in particular. I have a 75 milliliter or 2.5 fluid ounce bottle of this. They make it a lot of different sizes. I also have a much larger bottle that I use for my large scale airbrushing stuff, but you can use other types of varnish as well, such as maybe a gloss varnish or, you know, a more satin finish varnish. I prefer matte because I'm used to a real life military kind of equipment approach. And with that, usually vehicles in real life military are painted matte so they don't shine or reflect light and give themselves away. This also is a great way for locking in a lot of our weathering pigments and other things that we've used. It's also good for if you use shades, whether you did recess or you did wash shades and you placed them over your model. And maybe when you do that, sometimes they have a little bit of shine to them. They're a little more satin. And with that, it'll help make all of those matte. This is a very effective matte varnish. So I'm going to be putting it through my airbrush here and applying it to the model, but you can also brush it on. It works just as well that way. Make sure to shake it up really well, get it on your brush or feed it into your airbrush hopper and apply. I'm not thinning this down with the airbrush. I'm actually putting it straight into the hopper and spraying it onto the model. Go around your model and do nice thin coats to make sure you get it applied over all the surfaces. For anything that you think is going to have maybe some additional wear, you may want to apply a couple extra little coats over this. Make sure it does completely dry and cure first before applying additional coats over top of your previous coats. All right, and that is it for today's tutorial. So if you followed along with all about 41 steps of this process, you should have yourself a fully painted Rogal Dorn. So we've walked you through everything from base coating to getting down your washes, your highlights, your weathering options, and your other details on the model. You can also use this to paint any other Cadian vehicle of this style, or even swap out a few of the colors to make it your own. You could swap out the tan for maybe a gray to do a gray and green pattern, or any other combination that you would like to do. But feel free to experiment, make it your own a little bit if you want to, and customize. It's also okay to just walk through the tutorial step by step to get this exact same classic color scheme for the Cadian forces. So let me know if you have any questions down in the comments below. Hope you've enjoyed, and feel free to come back and watch more tutorials in the future or other videos that I do here on the channel. I really do appreciate your all support and do this out of love for the hobby. So as always, until next time, Cadia stands.